Your phone rings at 7:14 on a Tuesday morning, and you know before you answer that something is wrong, because your accountant has never once called you before 9. His name is Deshawn. You've worked with him for 6 years, ever since the business started making enough money that doing your own taxes stopped being a good idea. He is not a man who panics. He is a man who, when the IRS flagged your return 2 years ago over a decimal error that wasn't even your fault, sent you a 2-line email that said handled, don't worry about it, and then never mentioned it again. So, when you pick up and his voice is different, higher, faster, you sit up in bed before he said a full sentence. I need you to come into the office today, he says. Not this week, today. You ask what's wrong. I don't want to do this over the phone. That's the first sentence that stays with you. Not because of what it says, but because of what it doesn't. You've heard people say we need to talk before in relationships, and by now that the sentence itself is never really about the talking. It's about the fact that whatever comes next is going to rearrange something you thought was fixed in place. You cancel your morning, you don't shower, you drive to his office with the radio off, which is not something you do, and you notice that you're doing it, which makes it worse. His office is on the 4th floor of a building that used to be a bank, back when banks had marble floors and brass fixtures. And there's something almost funny about that, walking across old bank marble to find out you don't have the money you thought you had. You don't laugh. You just notice it. The way you notice small, useless details when your brain is trying not to think about the big one. Deshawn is standing when you walk in, which he never does. He's usually behind the desk, laptop open, coffee going cold. Today he's standing by the window with a folder in his hand, and the folder is thick, and you clock the thickness before you clock his face. Sit down, he says. You don't sit down. I need you to tell me what this is, you say, before I sit down for it. He looks at you for a second, like he's deciding how much softness the situation can afford. Not much, apparently, because what comes out is direct. The fund your father set up, the one that's been generating your distributions for the last 11 years. It's not what we thought it was. You wait for the rest. There's always a rest. It's not a fund, he says. Not in the way you've been told. There's no underlying asset base generating 4% a year like a normal trust. What's been happening is a payout structure. Money coming in from somewhere, going out to you on a schedule, and the balance sheet behind it has been shrinking every year instead of growing. You sit down now, not because you're ready to, because your legs make the decision without you. How long, you ask? I don't know yet. That's part of why I called you in instead of emailing. I found this by accident. I was reconciling something unrelated and the numbers didn't square, and I pulled the original documents, the ones from when your father set it up, and they don't match what we've been filing. You ask the question you don't want to ask. Is the money gone? Not all of it, but it's not 11 years of steady 4% growth sitting in an account somewhere. It's been drawn down, significantly. And I don't know why yet, because the original paperwork references a secondary party I've never seen before. A co-signer. You didn't know there was a co-signer. He turns the folder around and slides it across the desk, and there, on the second page, under your father's signature, is another name. A name you don't recognize. Not a bank. Not an institution. A person. Marguerite Voss. You say the name out loud, like saying it will make it mean something. It doesn't. You've never heard it before in your life. Deshawn says he ran a basic search. Nothing criminal, nothing public, no news articles, Just a name attached to two properties in another state and an LLC that dissolved 4 years ago. He says he doesn't know if she's alive, doesn't know if she's family, doesn't know if she's someone your father owed money to or someone who owed money to him. What he knows is that her name is on every distribution authorization for the last decade, which means somebody has had to sign off every single time you got paid. And it hasn't been you and it hasn't been your father, because your father has been dead for 6 years. You sit with that sentence longer than you sit with any of the others. Someone's been signing as her, you say. This whole time. Someone's been signing as her, he agrees. Or she's real, and she's the one who's actually been running this. You ask the obvious question. You ask how much is left. He doesn't answer right away, and that not answering is its own kind of answer. The way silence on the other end of a phone call tells you more than words would. When he does say the number, it's less than a third of what you believed you had an hour ago. Less than a third of the number that has quietly sat underneath every decision you've made for a decade. The house you didn't think twice about buying. The year you took off after your divorce because you didn't need the salary. The way you've talked to people, the ease in your voice when someone asked what you did for a living and you said, essentially, nothing, because you didn't have to. All of that was built on a number that was never what you were told it was. You ask him what happens now. Now, he says, we find out who Marguerite Voss is, because whoever she is, she's been quietly running your father's money for 6 years without you knowing you should be worried. You drive home and you don't turn the radio on this time either, but for a different reason. You're not trying to avoid thinking. You're trying to remember. You remember your father in his last year, thinner than you'd ever seen him, sitting in the study with the door closed more often than it used to be. You remember thinking it was because he was tired, because dying men close doors. You remember a phone call you overheard once, half a sentence through the wall. Your father saying she deserves to know eventually, just not like this. And you remember not asking who she was because you assumed it was your mother, already 3 years gone by then. And you assumed he was talking about grief in the abstract, a man processing his own mortality out loud to no one. You didn't ask. That's the part that sits heaviest. You had the chance to ask, and some part of you, some polite, non-intrusive part, decided a dying man's private sentence wasn't yours to open. Now you think it might have been the only warning you were ever going to get. That night you can't sleep, and somewhere around midnight you start going through the boxes in your closet, the ones from his house that you never fully unpacked, because unpacking them meant he was actually gone, and you weren't ready for that particular kind of gone. You find receipts. You find old letters from people you don't know, mostly forgettable, birthday cards and thank yous. And near the bottom, in an envelope that's been taped shut and then opened again, carefully, like someone wanted to reseal it without you noticing, you find a photograph. Your father, younger, maybe 35, standing next to a woman you've never seen, and on the back, in handwriting that isn't his, 4 words, M. Voss, before everything. You call Deshawn at 7 the next morning. He picks up on the first ring, which tells you he wasn't sleeping either. You tell him about the photograph, the handwriting, the phrase, before everything. You ask him what he thinks it means. I think it means your father had a life you didn't know about, he says. And I think whatever that life was, it's the reason the number in your account isn't what you thought it was. You spend the next week doing the kind of research that feels less like accounting and more like archaeology. Property records, an old business license under Marguerite's name, dissolved but with an address attached. A name that appears once, buried in a filing from 15 years ago, listed as beneficiary on something your father owned before you were even old enough to know what a beneficiary was. A daughter, not yours, not your mother's. Someone your father had before any of you, or during, or after, you don't know which. And the not knowing is somehow worse than any of the individual facts, because it means the story could be arranged 100 different ways, and every single arrangement changes who your father was to you retroactively. You drive to the address on a Saturday without telling Deshawn you're going, because some part of this feels like it stopped being about the money. The house is modest. Older woman answers the door, 60s maybe, gray hair pulled back, and when she sees your face, something happens in hers. Some recognition landing before you've said a word, which means you look like him. You've always been told you look like him. You never thought about what that meant until a stranger's face confirmed it in half a second on her porch. "You're his son," she says. Not a question. You say yes. You ask who she is. "I'm Marguerite," she says. "I've been waiting for someone to come ask me that for 6 years. You stand on the porch, and she doesn't invite you in yet, and you understand that this is a test, the same way everything since the phone call has been a test, a series of doors that only open if you ask the right question standing in front of them. "Who's the daughter?" you ask. Her face changes again, softer this time, and she steps back and holds the door open. "Come in," she says. "This is going to take longer than a porch conversation." Inside, over coffee you don't really want, but take anyway because refusing feels rude in a house you've just invaded with your grief. She tells you the story in pieces, the way people tell stories they've rehearsed alone for years, but never said out loud to the person who actually needed to hear them. Your father knew her before your mother. A relationship that ended, she says, not badly, just early, before either of them knew what they wanted. A daughter was born a year later. Your father knew. He paid, quietly, for decades, structured through the fund, through Marguerite's signature as trustee, because he didn't want it traceable back to a name that would require an explanation he was never brave enough to give. The fund wasn't draining because of theft. It was draining because it had been feeding 2 families the entire time, and only one of them knew it. "He was going to tell you," Marguerite says. "After the surgery, he told me that. He said he'd tell you once he was through it and strong enough to watch your face while he did it. He didn't make it through the surgery. You sit with your coffee going cold, and you think about the sentence you overheard through the study door. She deserves to know eventually, just not like this." You'd assumed it was about your mother. It wasn't. It was about you. You were the she, misheard through a wall, and he was talking about you deserving to know and running out of time to be the one to say it. You ask about your sister. Marguerite says her name is Elena, says she's 31, says she knows about you, has always known, the way you're only now learning about her, and has spent years assuming you knew too and simply didn't care to reach out. That lands harder than almost anything else that week. Somewhere out there, your entire life, a person existed who believed you'd chosen silence, when the truth was you never even knew there was a silence to choose. You ask Marguerite for a phone number. She writes it on the back of a grocery receipt because it's the only paper on the counter, and you fold it into your pocket like it might disintegrate if you're not careful with it. You don't call that night. You sit with it for 3 days, rehearsing openings that all sound wrong, because there is no correct sentence for "I just found out you exist, and I'm sorry it took a financial crisis to get here." When you finally do call, Elena picks up on the fourth ring, and there's a long pause after you say your name, the kind of pause that has 31 years folded into it. "I wondered if you'd ever call," she says. "I didn't know I was supposed to," you say. "I didn't know you existed until 9 days ago." Another pause, longer this time. "He really never told you," she says. It's not quite a question. It's the sound of a story rearranging itself in real time, the same rearrangement you went through on Marguerite's porch, just delivered to someone else's understanding of the same man. You talk for 2 hours. You don't resolve anything, because there's nothing to resolve in a single phone call. 31 years doesn't collapse into an evening. But you make plans to meet. Actually meet. In person, somewhere neutral. Both of you still circling the shape of a father who apparently had enough room in him for 2 entire hidden families, and not quite enough courage to let either of them see the whole picture while he was alive to manage the fallout. Deshawn calls a week later with the final numbers. The fund isn't what it was. It never will be again. But it's not gone. Not in the way your first sleepless night made you believe. It's smaller, permanently smaller, restructured now that Marguerite's signature is no longer quietly authorizing withdrawals nobody in your family knew to expect. You ask him what you're supposed to feel about all of it. He doesn't answer that one. Accountants don't do grief. He just says the paperwork is in order now, that going forward everything will be transparent, that you'll never again get a phone call at 7:14 in the morning about money you didn't know wasn't yours. You believe him about the money. You're less sure about the rest. Because here's what the last 3 weeks taught you, underneath all the numbers and the signatures and the drawn-down balance sheet. You thought you knew what you had. You thought the number in your account was the whole truth, solid, countable, done. And it turns out the money was never really the secret. The money was just the thread. Pull on it hard enough, and it doesn't lead you to a missing balance. It leads you to an entire sister, a woman who spent her whole life on the other side of a door your father never opened, waiting, the same as you, for someone to finally ask the right question standing on the porch. You're not as rich as you thought you were. You're something else instead. You're a person who just found out the story of his own life had a second half nobody told him about, running quietly alongside the first one the whole time. Funded by the same tired, complicated, cowardly, loving man who apparently believed that if he could just keep both doors closed a little longer, he'd eventually find the courage to open them himself. He never got the chance. So you're opening them instead. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story.